Welcome to the Mind of Miz Podcast. I'm your host, Miz Rivera. Really excited to go over Job chapter 6, verses 8 to 13 here today. Three things that we're going to look at. I'll tell you what they are very broadly now, but we're going to get into specific and into details in the next hour. The first is a category of prayer that seeks to ask God to do what we wish him to do. Yes, a category of prayer that wants to ask God just for those things that we wish would happen. Is that good? Is that bad? Stick around. You'll figure that out. The next thing that we would look at is, in some sense, we always speak to God, right? Even when we are not speaking to God. So how is it that we should use our speech? We're going to briefly touch on that. And then what do we do when we no longer have a desire to live? This is the most serious part of this podcast today. If you are struggling with thinking, I don't want to live anymore, life is just too hard, I'm struggling too much, stick around. There might be some important things here for you that you might learn from. And if you are interested in any of these things that we just talked about, I would ask you to please stick around. I think we just did about an hour and 15 minutes of teaching on this. You can take it in small bits. Okay. You don't have to take it in all at once. And if you do enjoy what we're doing here, please go to mindofmiz.com/subscribe, become a member of our site there and get plugged in with everything that we have going on. Other than that, thank you for watching. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mind of Miz Podcast. I'm your host, Miz Rivera. Today, we're going to be continuing through the book of Job. We're actually going to be looking at chapter 6, verses 8 to 14, or 8 to 13, actually. I was debating whether I wanted to go to verse 14, but I decided not to do that today. I think verse 14 is better, fits better with the next kind of paragraphs that we're going to look into in the book of Job. But I'm excited to do this. This is one of the most exciting things that I do all week. So I am excited about that. And I want to say thank you for all of those of you that are joining us. If you have not subscribed, but you find yourself regularly watching this online, then please go to mindofmiz.com/subscribe and make sure that you become a part of our emailing list. Okay, there's two options on there. Subscription does not cost you anything. So if you want to just join us and be able to get the emails, get the messages that we send out, get the updates that we send out, please do that. That's going to be something that is important, and it would mean a lot to us as well. So today we're going to be looking at this section of Job, which is an interesting part here. This is right before Job begins to address his friends in a more direct way. Here in this section between verses 1 and verse 13, Job is really, in a sense, talking out loud. He's not addressing God directly, although there are some claims that this is a kind of prayer, and I think we might go down that route and see where that takes us. That could definitely be a possibility. But at the end of the day, Job is really talking about the pain and the suffering that he's going through. Now, it's hard to do this teaching without talking about suffering and without talking about pain and all of these things, and that could make for a little bit of a depressing podcast, let's say. It could make us, want to run away from what the Bible says about what suffering is and pain is, because most of us just want to live a really happy life here, die and go to heaven and live a really happy life there. And it's as if that is the epitome of life. That's all we want. No pain, no danger. Everything's good. And, well, unfortunately, that's not the reality of life. And so one of the things that I find a little difficult trying to navigate through this is thinking about those of you that listen to this podcast that are going through a lot of things in your life. Those of you that listen to this podcast and are struggling right now and are suffering. And so I always try to make sure that we're not just bypassing or overlooking, I should say, your pain or your suffering. But at the same time, what we don't want to do here is coddle you, right? And maybe that's not the best word, but that's the word I'm going with here. You know, we don't want to make you think that your suffering should make you a victim before God or before the world. And we live in a time, in a place, in our world, in our society, in our culture, that, you know, it seems like part of our culture is talking about lifting up the human race, while the other, you know, part of it is making victims out of everyone. And those things are very contradictory in my mind. It's difficult to understand how you can lift up the human race while at the same time trying to create everybody, trying to make everybody have a victim mentality. You know, everyone's a victim of something. And so one of the things that I've seen, and this is just me observing, this is certainly my personal opinion, is that we want to make sure that we are not, as Christians anyways, sorry, I lost my track there for a second, but as Christians, that we are not becoming victims or becoming entrapped in the things that the world is offering. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm seeing a message on the board here, but I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you can explain that. Sorry, I'm talking to my producer here. Okay. Okay. So what we want to do then is talk to you from the book of Job, chapter 6, verses 8 through 14, in a way that will allow you to look at your mess and say, okay, that's happening. To say that's real. The pain that I feel is real. And here's a way that I could deal with it. That's kind of what I'm trying to go with. Okay. And I'm just, thank you for that information. I apologize, guys, if you're watching live. I got distracted. I'm looking at my chat here that we have going on, and I saw a message that looked cryptic to me. I didn't know what it was. So I don't know if I was supposed to stop or what, but it looks like we're all good, and my producer has made everything clear. So, all right, with that said, let's go ahead and look at these few verses here. I think this is going to be exciting. Let me give you, just to kind of give you a taste of what's coming. Here are three different things that I wrote down that I think will help you. Okay. The first is a category of prayer that seeks to ask God to do what we wish him to do. We're going to talk about that. Okay, I'll read that again. A category of prayer that seeks to ask God to do what we wish him to do. Okay. You're going to see that in this lesson. Second thing, in some sense, we always speak to God, even when we're speaking into the cosmos. Okay. When we're just complaining, we're just talking out loud. God is always listening. He's better than Alexa at that, right? They say Alexa's always listening to you. God is always listening, okay? And so we're going to see what that means. And then the third thing is, what do we do when we no longer have a desire to live? And this is the more serious part of this podcast. And I want to make sure that I tread biblically here, okay? So let's go to chapter 6, verse 8. Oh, that my requests might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. But it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait? And what is my end that I should endure? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Is it that my help is not within me and that deliverance is driven from me? We thank the Lord for the reading of the word. So I'm going to go through these verses one by one. And I'm going to start with what I see as the first part. Okay, if we wanted to break these down, I would probably break them down with verse 8 and 9 together, then verse 10 on its own, then verses 11 through 13. Okay, so those are the kind of the three parts that I'm going to try to attack this from. Okay, so we can get a proper understanding of that. Look at the first verse here. It says, "Oh, that my request might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing." Now, you got to remember from what we've been studying this entire time. In chapter 3, Job has this kind of outburst, let's say, right? In chapter 3. And he starts saying in verse 3, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived." Right? May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. And then he speaks of death in such an interesting way. He says, "There in death the wicked cease from raging," verse 17. "And there the weary are at rest. The prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master." And he goes on to say, "Why is light given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, but there is none, and dig for it, for death, more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice greatly and exult when they find the grave." And so if you remember, and if you haven't listened to that podcast, go back to the chapter 3 podcast. It's in our Spotify list. You can find it there pretty easily. But this is what, now when Job is speaking in chapter 3, and he starts in verse 8, and it says, "Oh, that my request might come to pass." He's referencing chapter 3. He's saying, I'm not going to address what life is. I'm not going to talk to him right now. I'm just going to point out that I still want to die. And so we come to sort of an impasse here. We're realizing that Job is not getting any comfort. His friends are not comforting him. The very presence is not even comforting him. His pain is not going away in his body. And he's getting to a point, and essentially at this point, he is at the point where he is exhausted. Now, I wish sometimes that our words would have more meaning. And what I mean by that is that, we leave work at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock after a long day, and we sit in traffic or whatever it might be. And by the time you get home, the words that a lot of times comes out of our mouth is, "I'm exhausted," right? Or, sometimes we banged our knee or maybe something happened and, we're in pain and we say, "I have an excruciating headache." And the word excruciating comes from the same word that we get crucifixion from the Latin. And so excruciato, it's this word that means essentially the most intense pain that you can imagine. And we take words like love and hate, and we use them for things like ice cream and Snickers bars and, shoes and, things that hang in our closet. And I have a problem with that because I even say words like that myself. And so it's almost like when you come to the Word of God, you have to look at the words carefully again, because they mean something. Every time God says something in His Word, it means something. It's important. And what we don't want to do is simply look over those words and just think they mean what we think it means. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that Job is not just tired. Job hasn't just had a long day. Job has been robbed of everything that he's ever had. Job has been abandoned by his wife, who's asked him to curse God and die. Job's children have all been killed in a horrific natural disaster. And Job himself, in his flesh, has been stricken with one of the worst diseases that a man can have. He is gaunt. He is at the threshold of death. And so we have to wonder, what exactly does he mean when he says that he's exhausted? Which is what you'll see him saying here in these next few verses. And he's already said it. We've already read them. And maybe you didn't catch it, but we want to slow down a little bit so you can catch these things, okay? So, again, he says, all that my requests might come to pass. He wants to die. And this is a pretty serious thing. Now, we don't want to confuse it here with suicide. That would be a very bad thing. If we try to confuse, Job's position as suicide, then we impugn the character of Job, and Job would be going against God himself. There is a preciousness that belongs to the life that God gives us. It is a precious thing. This is why, Christians are, a true Christian is pro-life. There's no such thing as a Christian that's not pro-life, particularly in the sense, let's say, of abortion or things like that. Another one that I have in mind is assisted suicide. These are two things that are being accepted at an alarming rate in our society, more and more. And we have to really be careful because we don't want to put words in Job's lips. However, there is a legitimate place in our lives where we can feel like death would be better. Okay. And that's what I want to touch. Okay. And I almost want to give some encouragement. This is difficult to talk about because I really don't want to mislead anyone. And so I'm gonna try my best to tread carefully here. But suffering, whether it's physical, mental, whatever it might be, whether it comes from abuse or whether it comes from a sick family member, whatever kind of suffering that there is, there are times in the mind of a human where ending life is preferable. Okay. And that's not exactly talking about ending your own life, but wishing that you just were dead. This is where Job is, okay, in his life. And I want to look at this from at least two different points of view that we'll get into here in just a second. I want to give you a brief overview of these two verses so you get an understanding of where I'm coming from when I give you my two different perspectives on this, okay? So first we see that in verse 8, he says, all that my requests might come to pass. So we know what that means. He wants to die. He really wants this. He's wishing this. Okay, this is a wish that he is doing. And it is a form, okay, and this is where I was talking about earlier. This is a category of prayer that seeks to ask God, okay, to do what we wish him to do. Okay, it's not asking God to do his will. It's asking God to do something we wish him to do. We have to be careful with those kinds of prayer. I'm not saying that the prayer in itself is a sin, because often the Bible does teach us in Romans, often we don't know how to pray. Most of us wouldn't even know how to address a proper king or queen. We might fumble our words. And so it's fair to say that we don't know exactly how to approach the God of the universe. But the Bible does teach us how to do that. And often it could be the case as Christians, we fail to approach God in the right way. And so here we can place, even though Job is speaking of God in the third person, there are some instances that we can find in the time that Job lived, that people that were talking to a king, instead of saying, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're going to talk to Joe Biden, the president, and you say, you're addressing him, yes, Mr. President. Instead of talking to him in that way, yes, Mr. President, I have a request. I want to see if you can help me with this. You would say, I ask of the President of the United States, the sovereign leader of this country, if he may indeed, oh, President of the United States, help me with this situation. Okay, so you kind of understand that. So there might be a prayer here, okay, that Job is saying in that sense. Even though he's speaking of God in the third person, it may be something that he's doing out of reverence to God, okay? Or it can be something that he is doing as he was doing in chapter 3, where he's speaking out into the cosmos in a sense, okay? And the reason that I say that is because of what we learned in chapter 1, okay? And the way that the author of this book here seems to describe that world, right, that's out there. And so we don't fully know with 100% specificity what exactly did Job believe of God, at the details. There's some scholars even that don't know exactly what Job believed would happen in the afterlife, okay? And we're not going to get into those details because the waters could get real muddy there, and we have to analyze the book of Job as a singular book, but also understand that it's part of a larger book of 66 books. And so we have to be able to shine the light of Christ on the book of Job in order to fully be able to understand and grasp it, particularly when we're starting to apply it to our lives. Okay. Well, we know what he's asking for here. And we see here that he is saying, and that in the second half of verse 8, that God will grant my longing. That word there, longing, is a yearning, a desire to have something, but it's typically used in the sense of something that you lost. For example, I long for the days where we used to hang out back in the day, right? When you have that kind of language. Or let's say that your husband has been sent off to war, and you long for your husband after 6 months or a year of not seeing him, and he out in the battlefield longs for his wife and his children. It's that kind of longing, which is really strange. Why is that strange? Well, think about it just for a second. It's strange because he's longing for death, but you don't long for something that you don't have. Typically, it's something that you know, that you've experienced, you've had it, you taste it, and you long for it. Let me bring it up to an even simpler example, real simple example. My dear wife, she has some allergies to certain foods, and often, I won't say what they are, but often when we're talking about certain foods, she yearns for those kinds of food because she's had them before. She knows what they taste like, and she longs to be able to have that. And sometimes she'll be like, I could just have a Benadryl with it, right? And it's this desire to just have that thing that I've enjoyed it. But how is it possible that Job is talking about death in this way? Well, I think it's because the entire time that he was sitting there in pain for at least 7 days, and perhaps before that, it was probably weeks, perhaps months before his friends ever got to him. And then he's sitting here listening to Eliphaz, drone on and drone on, he finally, during that whole time, he's been in some ways fantasizing about death. And it's become such a real thing. He's spoken of it in such a vivid way that it's almost as if he can taste it. It's almost as if, wait a minute, I know what that feels like and I long for that. I want to have that thing. And so it's a very strange word that is used here, at least the way I see it, because he's longing for something he's never had. You know, most people won't long for death because they don't know what comes after death. And if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, you often, you're kind of scared of death. You don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to be dark or cold or hot? We don't know. And so often people are trying to, do their best to stay away from death. They're not longing for it. But if you suffer enough, apparently there comes a time where you may long for something like death. And this is where he's at. And then look at verse 9 where he says, would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. Well, this part here is interesting because he's asking, what is God willing to do? And this is part of that category of prayer that seeks to ask God to do what we wish him to do. This is the part where he has now said it twice here almost. He's using a similar form of language. Oh, that my request might come to pass. We're top of verse 8. Top of verse 9. Would that God were willing to crush me. It's a wishful kind of thinking. It's not hope. It's a wish. It's something that cannot come true. Well, he says that he would loose his hand and cut me off. This is one of the most, it took me a minute to really try to learn what this meant, because I thought when I first read this was that Job wanted God to just destroy him. I saw cut me off, bottom of verse 9, where it says cut me off. I saw that as a parallel to the word crush before it. And boy, was I wrong. They're not the same thing. The first, which is willing to crush, is to annihilate, to flatten. Okay? And it's to flatten something that's not designed to be flattened, if you want to think about it that way. If you remember, if you're as old as I am, you might remember those old cartoons where Tom and Jerry, or one of those kind of cartoons where the cartoon would get crushed, flattened like a pancake, and then they're kind of like squeezing one limb out at a time. Well, in the real world, if you ever get crushed like that, there's no coming back from that. And that's the word that is being used here. And he's saying, God, crush me, annihilate me, get rid of me. Okay? This is what he's saying here. But then in the second half, he says that you will cut me off. And I thought, well, this is just another way of saying the same thing. Let's move on. We're done here. And we're not. Upon further, studying, I realized that this word is a word that in its origin was used in the industry of weaving, okay? Of weaving, which is, if you've ever gone to a museum, maybe you've seen those old looms where they have all these yarn or string, and they have someone even there kind of building a tapestry of some sort. And so it's a word that's used in that industry, okay? And it means to pluck off one of those strings. And so the imagery that is being drawn here is as God as a weaver, if that's the right term, as someone who's weaving a tapestry, okay, and he's weaving this tapestry, and there's all these strings, and then there's the not the word string is not the right word. I'm not a weaver, so forgive me here, but what is it you call the actual? It's not a string. It's not yarn, something like yarn, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Thread. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay. And he's using whatever he's woven to use as a thread, and he's threading things through on this tapestry that he's doing. And so if you can imagine that, the way that I envision this anyway, is that here God is busy pulling on the strings, doing what he has to do, bringing the loom back and forth, doing the things that he has to do there as he's creating this tapestry of life that he has the design in his mind, the decrees in his mind. He knows what's going to happen. And all of a sudden, there's one little string that just starts talking. One little piece of thread, it just starts yapping away. Say, hey, cut me off. I don't want to be here no more. And look the way that it says it. It says, would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand. Stop doing what you're doing. Stop being so busy working on this tapestry and come cut me off. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. I mean, you think about that. And you often wonder, boy, you would think God would just pluck him out of existence. But what Job doesn't realize, and we often don't realize when we pray in this way, what we often don't realize is that God is using all of these things. He's the one at work pulling the strings, if you want to think about it that way, not in the form of a puppet, but building a tapestry. That's the picture that we should have in our mind here. So the first word crush is so violent. But then this other one, to me, it's more personal. Cut me off. I don't want to be part of the tapestry no more. This is no fun. It was fun when everything was in its place, when I had my kids, when I had my wife, when I had my house. All that was great. Not anymore. I don't want any part of it. And so this is where I need to stop here for a moment and talk to you a little bit about the two things that I see here that are going on. Maybe by way of application, if we want to think about it that way, but it's just something I want to talk to you about. Well, the first part has to do with Christians that suffer and forget that they are sinners before God. We all suffer. That there's no question about that. We all suffer. We suffer every day. Even if you don't feel it, there's always, you're dying every day. We talked about this in one of our previous lessons. And we're sinners. Even if you're the most righteous person, even if you're someone like Job, who God himself says you're blameless, that doesn't change the fact that before God, you're still a sinner. You might be blameless in the sense before men. You may have reached a very high level in sanctification, but before God, you're still a sinner. And so while it is true that the doctrine of divine retribution is not true as a rule, meaning that just because I'm suffering doesn't mean that I've committed some kind of sin. We have to remember that whether God is trying to teach me something, God is trying to save me through this, or God is rebuking me. These are the three options that we've talked about here in the book of Job. it doesn't matter which one of those three it is. We have to recognize our own status as sinners before God. Okay? I remember a long time ago, and I was back in my 20s. I remember a pastor saying, I don't believe that we are sinners saved by grace. We're just saved by grace. We're no longer sinners. and I just looked at him like, that doesn't make any sense. What do you mean you're not a sinner? When did you stop sinning? Exactly. And so it doesn't matter, even if you're not sinning to the capacity, and you shouldn't be sinning to the capacity that you were before you came to Christ, you are still a sinner. And so the big picture here that I need you to think about is that no matter what suffering you go through, or even what blessing you have in your life, you get it in the status of being a sinner. Which means you don't deserve the mercy and you don't deserve the blessing. In other words, if God's wrath was truly to be displayed to you as the sinner that you are, you would be but a shadow. You'd be nothing. But we don't think about these things. And so we forget these things. And often when we forget that we're just a sinner before God, we get a little self-righteous about our suffering. Does that ever happen? Do you know someone like that? That gets self-righteous about their suffering? I shouldn't be going through this. I'm a son or a daughter of God, and I shouldn't be going through this. And so this is something I need you to think about as we're talking about this. Okay, so we're sinners. That's one thing we know. I think we can all agree on that, although there's some out there that won't agree with that. But here's what we also are, because two things could be right. Okay, we are sinners, but we are also soldiers. So look at Ephesians. We're soldiers and we're called into battle. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Okay, verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And it keeps going, talking about the armor there. I'm sure you're very, very familiar with this. Well, if what God is calling us to as believers is a battle, is asking to die in the middle of a battle being strong? No. You're asked to fight. Right? You can imagine this. You can imagine that you wouldn't consider someone brave if they were a trained soldier. God does train us up for things. He does not allow us to carry a cross that we cannot bear. So that means that he trains us up as we go. And, you know, there are times you can imagine a trained soldier who goes into battle and the first thing that he says is, just kill me now. I can't handle this. This is too much. No. Now, he might still get killed in battle. He might still get wounded in battle, but he must fight. And there are great, great stories of heroes in wars, you know, that fought even while they were hurt, even facing, you know, dramatic odds. They still fought. So the idea is that asking for death, while for many might be a reality, meaning you are suffering that much in your life right now, it is often a selfish prayer. And it's often, in that sense, sinful. And this is one of the things that when I look at Job here, I don't know. I'm not God, so I don't know how God, who knows the heart, took this when Job said this. But it seems to me, to some degree, whether Job is getting carried away here, whether Job's suffering has become so great that he has stopped thinking through some of the things that he is saying here. He has now gone against the will of God for his life. Well, why do we say that? Well, because he's waking up every day. He wakes up with life every day. And yet here he is wishing it away. And I feel that often as Christian and people, unbelievers suffer with this to a very strong degree as well. And that is that you want to end this life, or you wish that this life would end. Again, Job is not struggling with suicide here, but he is praying to God to cut him off, to crush him, get rid of him. And what I'm saying is, as I look at this and I study this, Job forgot, maybe for a moment, and we certainly would forget, that what's going on here is that he's in the middle of a battle. He's at war. It's a spiritual war. How do we know that? Well, we know that because the Satan has said, do this to him, and watch, he's going to curse it to your face. And God has done these things. He's at war. He's at battle. He just doesn't know it yet. Okay? And in fact, I think he does know it. To give Job credit here, I think Job's probably a lot smarter than I was, or will be, or am. But the suffering is intense right now, and so he's speaking from a very hurting place, and we have to keep that in mind. Okay, well, what's the second part? That's the first part. Okay, that's one way to look at this. That is to say, we shouldn't be wishing for death. Okay. Well, this is going to sound a little contradictory, but I promise you it's not. The second part is, well, God's wrath, when it is actually revealed to a person, does make you want to die. And that is a serious reality. One example that comes to mind, for example, and I don't remember exactly where this is in the New Testament, but it's where in the transfiguration of Jesus, there was a lot of excitement on Peter's part. And then when that booming voice of God is heard, all of a sudden they drop as if they're dead. There's another passage in the New Testament that I'm reminded of as well. I don't have it in my notes here. But it's when Christ, Jesus himself, is talking about, the perilous times that are going to happen, and where people will run to the mountains and say, fall on me, because they see the wrath of God coming. And so, to them, annihilation, crushing, cutting off, you don't want to be a part of it. In some ways, Job is being pulled by God into this tapestry, and all he could see is bleak in front of him. He just sees day after day of being on top of this hill, and God, in some ways, and I'm very careful saying this, but in some ways, God, manifesting his wrath day after day after day, and Job's like, I just can't deal with that. I can't deal with knowing that God is showing his wrath and his displeasure with me, because I'm a sinner at the end of the day, and God has every right to do whatever he pleases. And so, well, he can't stand the calamity anymore. He says, I bet you I could stand the death. Kill me. It would be better off. And so there's a reality here. There's a reality that we have to consider. Now, that being the case, I doubt, I'm with Calvin on this one, I doubt that many of us have ever struggled with that kind of experience. Because often in the Bible, what you find is the people that have these types of experiences where they really see the wrath of God for what it is. They tend to be very, very, very close to God. And men, and Christians, I'm talking about Christians here as well, we're often too self-absorbed to notice the wrath of God. You know, it's been said time and again by a number of well-known teachers that we are in the middle right now of God's wrath on this country. And if you go to the mall, you won't know that. You know, if you walk around their neighborhood, me and my wife were going for a walk and we went to go grab a meal before the podcast started, and looking around, people just going about their day. You won't know that God's wrath is on this country. You just don't see it. We're too self-absorbed. Okay. Our eyes, even as Christians, are often closed to that. You know, it's why there's so much warning often to look at the times, to see what's going on, to learn to pray and pray to God. And we forget to do these things. We really do. And to reiterate my earlier point, we have to have a close relationship to God, because when we're very close to God, then we have a high level of sensitivity to even just a glimpse of God's wrath. And this is true. I wanted to share with you a story from a book by Saint Augustine titled Confessions. Okay. This is a great book. If you haven't read it, I would suggest that you do read it. And in one of the sections in book 2 of this, I think it's like a 5-part book. No, more than that. Probably a 10-part book. But anyways, in part 2 of it, there is a interesting story, and I want to read it to you. If you've heard of this, you're going to enjoy it because this is St. Augustine. And if you've never heard of this, please listen carefully. This is very important. Again, let me remind you why I'm reading this. It's because when you're closer to God, you really do get a higher sense, or you become more sensitive to the wrath of God and to who God actually is. So let's read this. This is St. Augustine. It is certain, O Lord, that theft is punished by your law, the law that is written in men's hearts and cannot be erased however sinful they are. For no thief can bear that another thief should steal from him, even if he is rich and the other is driven to it by want. Yeah, I was willing to steal, and steal I did, although I was not compelled by any lack, unless it were the lack of a sense of justice or a distaste for what was right and a greedy love of doing wrong. For of what I stole, I already had plenty, and much better at that, and I had to wish to enjoy the things I coveted by stealing. I had no wish to enjoy the things I coveted by stealing, but only to enjoy the theft itself and the sin. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, loaded with fruit that was attractive neither to look at nor to taste. Late one night, a band of ruffians, myself included, went off to shake down the fruit and carry it away. For we had continued our games out of doors until well after dark, as was our pernicious habit. We took away an enormous quantity of pears, not to eat them ourselves, but simply to throw them to the pigs. Perhaps we ate some of them, but our real pleasure consisted in doing something that was forbidden. Look into my heart, O God, the same heart on which you took pity when it was in the depths of the abyss. Let my heart now tell you what prompted me to do wrong for no purpose, and why it was only my own love of mischief that made me do it. The evil in me was foul, but I loved it. I loved my own perdition and my own faults, not the things for which I committed wrong, but the wrong itself. My soul was vicious and broke away from your safekeeping to seek its own destruction, looking for no profit in disgrace, but only for disgrace itself. St. Augustine goes on to write, what a parody of life, what an abomination, what abysmal death could I enjoy doing wrong for no other reason than it was wrong. Why am I reading this to you? Well, he was a kid, a teenager, a young man, and stole fruit from a pear tree. A pear. I haven't ate a pear in a long time. In fact, when I first thought of this story, I thought it was peaches, because at least peaches taste a little better than pears. Who likes a pear? It's like the poor man's apple, right? He's talking about pears. And he's looking back, now that he's converted and regenerated and his heart has been changed by the love of God. And he looks back to his sin and he can't stand it. He recognizes in his sin, he recognizes in his nature that the wrath of God, he deserves it all. See, we don't talk about a lot of times our former sin this way. We reminisce about our sin. Often we look back and we say, back in my day, boy, if I was back in my day, this is what I would do. No, you're not close to God. You're far from him, even if you're a Christian. Go with me to Habakkuk, chapter 3. I mentioned this a lot, but it's because it's one of the most touching things I have ever come across in the scripture. I love the book of Habakkuk. Look at chapter 3. This after, in verse 20 in chapter 2, says, but the Lord in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him. Is God's wrath about to be unleashed? And in chapter 3, the prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, he says in verse 2, Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. What a plea from a man who has seen God, a man who had experienced God deeply. He understood and he saw the wrath of God coming, and he shook. And I could almost guarantee you that the people didn't have a clue. And yet here was the man of God praying for them. God, in your wrath, have mercy. I feel that should be the prayer of all Christians upon our nation today, as we see the hand of God descend upon this country. When this country tries to legalize every sin and every unethical thing that you can imagine, that which just 25, 30 years ago we repudiated, we now laud as a freedom. That's because we don't know God. And when you don't know God, you're too self-absorbed to notice the wrath of God. Well, Christ was not self-absorbed. Look what he says in the book of Mark, chapter 15. Here we see Christ upon the cross. If we look at verse 33, because when the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land. Until the 9th hour, the wrath of God was coming in upon the Son of God, his very own Son, his only begotten Son, who had taken upon himself the sin of the elect, of those that he came to save. And now, as Christ is feeling the wrath of God upon the cross being poured on him, he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the wrath of God who comes upon the Christ that has saved us. He knew what it was because he was close to the Father, closer than any one of us can ever be. But he recognizes it. But what happens to the very Son of God right after he says these words? Oh, just when you think it's gotten as bad as it can get, listen to what a commentator says here, or Mark says here, he says, when some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, behold, he is calling for Elijah. And as Christ is standing there on the cross, nailed to the cross, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? It says someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink, saying, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Even at that final hour, when today we give men that are murderers and rapists, we give them a delicious steak meal as their last meal. Christ just got sour wine. He suffered beyond what you are capable to think of. He suffered the very wrath of God. But when he prayed, not wished, when he prayed in the garden, he said, if it be your will, pass this cup from me. That is not what Job said. Job said, oh, that you would kill me and do what I wish. This is why you and I ought to examine our cry out to God. Are you suffering? And have you cried out to God? I ask you, is it a counterfeit cry? Is it the kind of cry that's selfish? Or are you crying because you know you deserve more? And you could feel God away from you. And you feel that your sin has separated you from your God. Well, there's some encouragement here for you. You're in the battle. And so you must fight. Because our hope remains in the victory that Christ has secured for us. You see, the unbeliever has none of that hope. The unbeliever is self-absorbed now and can't even imagine the wrath of God. He or she lives merry, drinking and giving away in marriage, doing the things that they want to do. But one day, they will see the wrath of God coming. And they'll be burning in the fires of hell. And they will have nowhere to run. There'll be nothing that they can go to, no mountain they could say, fall upon me, no wish that they could make. But every turn that they make will go deeper and deeper into the wrath of God. Yes, you and I as Christians suffer, but we are so close to the loving embrace of God. And we are closer today to blissful eternity than we were yesterday. It matters what you're going through. Because if God is keeping you alive through it, it's because it matters. Because He's trying to teach you something. He's bringing you closer. He is saving you. Do not despise Him now. And don't despise your own life. Don't say to God, end it. Tell Him, give me the strength that I need to carry my cross. We have so much more to say on that. But I have to try to get through these verses, and I don't know if I'll be able to in the time I have left. But let's try. Let's look at verse 10 real quick. Here Job says, but it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. I love this verse, because this verse here shows us Job's victory over the Satan. He has not cursed God to his face. You see it there. I have not denied the words of the Holy One. Remember, in suffering, remember you're being made righteous before God. And what I mean is that you have been made righteous before God. And you need to remember that in suffering. You need to remember that when you're suffering and you're going in pain, you have to remember Ephesians 6. I'm in a battle. This battle is not about flesh and blood. It's a spiritual battle. And I have to fight. But you have to remind yourself, I'm righteous before God. He has made me righteous. This is not arrogance. This is what Job is doing. Job is saying, listen to his words here carefully. Listen carefully. But it is still my consolation. Here, he means this is what consoles me. This is what gives me hope. And he says, and I rejoice. The word there, rejoice, means to jump for joy. It's this leap of joy. Much like the leap that John the Baptist felt while he was still in the womb of his mother Elizabeth. And Christ was there. He heard the voice of the mother and he leaped for joy. It's this recognition in the midst of your suffering, in the midst of your pain, where you leap for joy because you remember, I have been made righteous before God. Not because of anything I've done, but because of the work that He has done. And then he says, and I rejoice, I leap for joy, even in the midst of unsparing pain. This is another beautiful word here. Unsparing is exactly what it sounds like. It's an unending thing. But the word pain there, it's the only time that it's used in the Bible in this way. But at its root, what it means is labor pains. He's describing it as an unending labor pain. But the joy that comes from the new life that's coming. And this is what's in the mind of Job. And he says, and I have not denied the words of the Holy One. You know, we go to Matthew chapter 26. Go with me there. Look at verse 69. And you'll notice something that parallels the story in an interesting way. It's the opposite, but they're connected in some way. Now Matthew chapter 26, verse 69, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, you too were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are talking about. When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away. Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he, Peter, went out and wept bitterly. So in one instance, we have Peter weeping bitterly. And in the other, Job, in his suffering, he knows he hasn't denied his God, and he can rejoice. That's the difference, you see. if you could take your suffering and realize that it's a conduit to know God. Nobody wants to take away your suffering. Nobody wants to say that it's nothing. Well, perhaps some do, but that's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you, I know it's real. But it is a way to know God. Do not deny God. Do not deny His word. You will weep bitterly. But if you obey, if you humble yourself, you will rejoice. Look at verse 11 through 13 here. We'll try to wrap this up here. What is my strength that I should wait? What is my end that I should endure? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Is it that my help is not within me, that deliverance is driven from me? Here, the word strength in verse 11. What is my strength? Refers to energy. What kind of energy? Well, it's the kind of energy that it takes to be patient, to wait and to endure. There's a roller coaster that Job is on here. At one moment he suffers, at another he's thinking of his righteousness before God, and another he's back at the depths of sorrow. And he says, what is my strength? He says, I have no more energy. I'm exhausted. I don't even know if he's responding to Eliphaz at this point and all the wonderful promises. If you guys remember the end of chapter 5, that Eliphaz is saying, oh, you're going to have a long life and your children and this and all that. He's just saying, look, I don't have the energy it takes to be patient anymore. I just don't. Waking up alive every day for Job was an exhaustion. He wasn't exhausted at the end of the day. He was exhausted at the start of the day. He probably only got to sleep from exhaustion and then woke up and said, I'm not dead yet. I've been wishing to be dead for a long time now. When will it happen? What's interesting is that it's the arrows of God from earlier in verse 4. Remember, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. These arrows of God were exhausting Job. They have sapped him of all his energy. He hadn't realized yet that those were only the arrows. God could have done much worse. But in His mercy, He did not. When the Satan said, let me strike the flesh, He says, you can do that, but don't take his life. And yet Job is saying, I don't want my life. But this is what we have to wake up to, the reality that even in suffering, if you have life, it's because God has given it to you. And the Word of God would teach us to not despise that. Then he says, what is my end? I love these two words here. What is my strength? Then what is my end? The end here refers to the limits of humanity, the limitations that sin has placed on us, that our sin nature does not allow us to go beyond a certain point. Our culture wants to extend life. It wants to make life easy and comfortable. We want to cure cancer and extend human life. We want to travel through the space. We want to settle in for the long haul. God says, you fool, tonight I require your soul. Who are we? As pitiful as we are, that God gives us salvation. for us to then go and when we endure suffering for the cause of Christ as Christians, to want God to pluck us from this earth instead of saying, Lord, what shall I learn from this? I'm not saying that's easy. Noah knew about the limitations. We won't go there, but Genesis 6:13 talks about the limitations of man. In Job, obviously, we're talking about that. David in Psalm 39, verse 5, you can look these up. Jeremiah 51:13. These men recognize the limitations on humanity. Our human end is characterized by limitations. Everywhere you go, you're limited. That should remind you who you are and who God is. In Isaiah 53:10, where it talks about Christ there, the Bible says that it pleased God to crush him, talking about Christ. But there was no crushing for Job. This is a lesson we have to learn today. If God is yet not willing to crush you, it's because he wants you to live. And that should not exhaust you. You have to press into God. Verse 13 talks about deliverance. Look at this. Is it that my help is not within me and that deliverance is driven from me? Just two quick things here that I could say on this. One, Job's inner strength. You could almost say his willpower was gone at this point, and his resources were being drawn away. And so he really can't see what's next. He can't see what's next on the horizon. He says, necesendero. This is where he's at. So let me give you three things that you can walk away with here that might help you. Because, I can't help it, but these are serious things that we have to go through here in the book of Job. It's not for the weary, that's for sure. Here are three things you can do. You can pray better. Pray God's will. Pray to understand his will. And pray for peace. Pray. I can't explain to you what prayer does. It's hard to put into words. I'm not good at describing it, but I know what it does in my life. I know that when I go to God in prayer, it's better than any technique that I can use to try to get myself out of whatever bind I find myself in. Pray. 2, think about your words. How can you better glorify God in your speech? Yes, you're exhausted. Yes, you're suffering. But how can your speech be different? How can it glorify God more? I'm not telling you to go wish yourself a new house, wish yourself a new job, or wish yourself some health. Speak something into existence. That is garbage. Not real. And if that's what you think, just go read Napoleon Hill and go at it. But that's not what you're going to get here. But think about your words. Think, how do I glorify God? Then the last thing is, remember you're in a battle. And it's going to hurt. You'll be in a lot of pain. But there is bliss in heaven. So keep obeying God. That's all the time I got. Lord, we thank you for this time. Thank you for your word. We appreciate you all. Thank you for listening and watching. Go to mindofmiz.com and subscribe. This has been the Mind of Miz Podcast. Thanks.